I have shot 1,000 horses in my time and buried more friends than I can count in this dry Arizona ground. But the thing I remember clearest about that autumn is the sound of boots on the road at dusk. A whole town's boots, moving in one direction, the way water moves when a dam gives. I was standing in the door of my livery with a rasp still in my hand, and I remember thinking that a sound like that never means mercy. It means a crowd has decided something, and a crowd that has decided something is the most dangerous animal God ever let walk upright. They were coming for Junia Ellard. I ought to tell you who I am first, so you'll know what my word is worth. Name's Reuben Marsh. I kept the livery and the smithy in Sabino Wells for 41 years, which means I knew every horse in the valley and near about every soul who rode one. A liveryman sees a town the way a doctor sees a body, from the inside, where the ugliness lives. Men who are all handshakes on the boardwalk will curse and kick a lame animal where they think nobody's watching, and I was always watching. So when I tell you that Junia Ellard was the finest woman that town ever mistreated, you can set it down as the truth of a man who had no reason to lie and every reason to have seen otherwise. She came to Sabino Wells a widow at 26, with a black dress gone gray from washing and a pair of hands that could do anything. Her husband had been a wheelwright over in Coldwater, and the fever that took him near about took her too, but it didn't, and when she was strong enough to travel she came west to where nobody knew the shape of her grief. That's a thing people do. They think if they walk far enough the sorrow won't follow, and it always does, but sometimes the walking gives them time to make peace with it on the road. Junia made her peace. By the time she stepped down off Holly's Prute's freight wagon in front of my livery, she had the still, level look of a woman who has already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to her, and knows it. I remember she asked me, first thing, where a person might rent a room and whether the town had need of a midwife. I told her the room she could have from the widow Sunt, and as for a midwife, we'd been getting by on old Effie Dornan, who was near blind and shook so bad she couldn't thread a needle. I said it kindly enough, but Junia heard what I didn't say, which was that we needed her badly. She only nodded, the way you'd nod at a thing you already knew. Inside of a year, that woman had delivered half the babies born in the valley and set more bones than the traveling doctor who came through twice a season and charged like a bandit. She knew herbs the doctor didn't. She knew how to turn a breech child with her hands, so gentle the mother scarcely knew it was done. She sat up all night with fevered children and never once asked to be paid when a family had nothing, and there were plenty who had nothing. She'd take a dozen eggs, or a mended harness, or a sack of beans and call it square, and she'd say it in a way that let a poor man keep his pride. I saw her do it. I saw her tell Cordell Baxter, who hadn't 2 coins to rub together, that she was in his debt for the loan of his mule the week prior, when everybody in the county knew Cordell didn't own a mule and never had. She just wanted the man to be able to look her in the eye. That was Junia, and that is why what the town did to her sits in my chest to this day like a swallowed stone. It began with the Dunmores. Royce Dunmore ran the biggest spread on the North Range and half owned the bank besides, and he wore his wealth the way some men wear a gun, not to use it exactly, but so you'd never forget he could. He'd married late, a soft-spoken girl named Cass from a good family down in Tucson, and she was carrying their first child that fall. Junia had tended her the whole way through, and she told me once, quiet, that she didn't like the look of it. Cass was narrow through the hips, and the baby had come to sit wrong, and there was a thing about her color and her breathing in those last weeks that Junia said she'd seen before, and never once seen come to good. She told Royce Dunmore straight out that his wife needed a doctor for the birthing, a real doctor with the tools for it, and that he ought to send to Tucson in time and pay to have one waiting. Royce Dunmore did not send. I couldn't tell you why. Pride, maybe. He had a notion that his money made him a match for anything, and a notion that a hired midwife was good enough for a rancher's wife, and a notion, I think, that Junia was fussing to run up her fee because that is how a certain kind of man understands the whole world. Everybody's angling for his money. When you believe that long enough, you can't hear a warning even when it's shouted in your ear. She told him twice more. He waved her off both times. The night Cass Dunmore came to her time was the worst night I ever passed in that town, and I wasn't even in the room. Junia was there from dark to dawn and past it. I know because I was up half the night myself with a colicky mare, and I saw the lamp burning in the Dunmore house across the flat, and I saw the boy they sent galloping for anybody who could help, and I saw, near 4 in the morning, Junia's own hired girl running to fetch hot water from the well because they'd used everything in the house. And I heard, when the sun was near up, the sound a house makes when there is nothing left to be done in it. I have heard it a few times in my life. You never mistake it for anything else. The child lived, a boy. Junia saved him, pulled him into the world with her 2 hands out of a birth that had already killed his mother, and she saved him when a lesser woman would have lost them both. But Cass Dunmore was dead, and dead women don't argue their own case, and by noon of that day, there was already a story going around Sabino Wells, and the story did not say a doctor had been begged for and refused. The story said the midwife had lost Royce Dunmore's wife. Now here is a thing I learned in 41 years, and it's the truest thing I know about people. Grief has to go somewhere. It's like water, it doesn't just sit, it runs downhill and it finds the low place and it pools there. And when a proud man's grief comes up against the fact that the loss was his own doing, that his own stubbornness killed the wife he loved, why, that grief will run anywhere on God's earth before it will run toward the truth. It has to find some other low place to pool. And the lowest place in that town, the easiest place, was a widow with no family and no man to stand for her. Royce Dunmore did not say that first week that Junia had murdered his wife. He was too broken to say much of anything, and I'll grant him that his sorrow was real, whatever it curdled into after. But there were others glad to say it for him. There was Vernon Slade, who ran the mercantile and had a mouth on him that could turn a rumor into scripture, and who'd never forgiven Junia for tending the poor on credit when he thought she ought to send them to buy his patent tonics instead. And there was Effie Dornan, the old midwife Junia had replaced, who had lost her small living and her small importance the day that black-dressed widow stepped off my freight wagon, and who had been waiting 3 years for exactly this. Effie went about town with her shaking hands and her wet, spiteful eyes, telling anybody who'd stand still that she'd known all along the Ellard woman's ways weren't natural, that she used herbs no Christian ought to use, that she'd seen her gathering plants by moonlight, which was a lie, and that Cass Dunmore had been hale and hearty till the midwife got her hands on her, which was a worse lie. Set a man's grief next to another woman's spite next to a shopkeeper's spleen, and give it 2 weeks in a small town in a dry season with not enough to do, and you have built yourself a fire. All it wants is a wind. The wind came when the Dunmore baby took sick. It was nothing but colic and the summer complaint, the sort of ordinary misery that half the babies in the territory come down with in their first months, and it passed off inside of 3 days like it always does. But for 3 days, Royce Dunmore stood over that cradle certain his son was dying too, certain the same evil that took his wife had come to finish the job, and by the time the fever broke he had built in his own head a whole terrible edifice, and at the center of it stood Junia Ellard. He would not have her near the child, of course. He'd sent to Tucson at last, too late for his wife, and got a proper doctor out on the stage who took one look at the baby and said it was nothing but wind, and charged Royce $40 for the saying of it. And I think some part of Royce Dunmore knew, standing there with that doctor's bill in his fist, exactly whose fault the whole thing had been. And I think that knowing was the thing he could least of all afford to feel. So he turned it the way a man turns a hot iron so it won't burn his own hand. He turned it into rage, and he pointed the rage at her. He came into the Slade mercantile of an evening, they told me later, and stood in the middle of it and said, in a voice that carried out into the street, that he wanted the witch gone from Sabino Wells before the week was out. He used that word. Witch. A grown man, a banker, a man who'd sat in a church pew every Sunday of his life, and he stood in a store full of decent people and called a woman a witch, and not one soul in that store told him he ought to be ashamed. That was the wind. After that, it was only a question of how long the fire took to reach her door. I did what a coward does, and I'm not proud of it. I went to her. I told her what was being said. I told her she ought to think about moving on before it got worse, said it gentle, said it like a friend, and I even offered to hitch a team and drive her wherever she wanted at no charge, and I told myself I was being kind. But a man knows the difference between kindness and getting a hard thing away from his own door before it breaks, and I knew. She listened to me the way she listened to everybody, level and quiet. And when I was done, she said the thing I have carried ever since. She said, "Reuben, if I run, I say I did it. And I didn't do it. I begged that man to send for a doctor and he wouldn't, and I stayed in that room till my hands cramped and I saved his son, and I will not slink off into the dark and let them write it that I killed his wife. She deserves the truth told over her, even if I'm the only one left to tell it. I'll go where the Lord sends me when he sends me, but I won't be run." I hadn't the answer to that. There isn't an answer to that. It's just the truth, and the truth doesn't argue. I went back to my livery and I felt about 2 inches tall and I did not sleep, and inside of a week the boots came down the road at dusk. They meant to run her out that night, you understand. Not lynch her. I'll say that much for Sabino Wells. We weren't that kind of town, or we didn't think we were, which isn't quite the same thing. But there's more than one way to kill a woman, and running a widow out into the desert at dusk with no team and no protection and nowhere to go is one of them. And every man in that crowd knew it, and told himself it wasn't so because he wasn't the one holding the rope. They'd been at the saloon most of the afternoon. Vernon Slade was at the head of them, and Royce Dunmore behind him, gray-faced and terrible, and behind them 30 or 40 men and even a few women, carrying lanterns against the coming dark, and their faces had that look I've told you about, that one animal look, where the men who tipped their hats to you on Sunday have gone somewhere behind their own eyes and left the animal in charge. They pulled her out of the widow Sun's front room. She hadn't run. She'd packed a small valise, the way a person does who has thought hard about a thing and made her peace with it, and she was standing in the doorway in her gray dress with her chin up when they came, and she did not scream and she did not beg, and I think that steadiness enraged them worse than tears would have. A crying woman they could have pitied, a woman standing straight as a fence post looking each of them in the eye that they couldn't abide because it made them see themselves. I came out of my livery. I want you to know I came out. But I was one old man with a rasp, and Vernon Slade told me to get back inside if I knew what was good for me, and God help me, I hesitated. I did not go back inside, but I hesitated, and in that hesitation I understood exactly what kind of man I was, and it wasn't the kind I'd always told myself. They marched her east on the Tucson road, out past the last houses, out to where the town gives up and the desert begins, meaning to leave her there in the falling dark with her one small valise, 40 miles of nothing between her and anywhere. Vernon Slade was making a speech of it, the way that kind always does, needing everyone to agree that this cruelty was a righteous thing. And Junia walked in the middle of them with her back straight and said not one word, and the sun went down red behind the Sabino hills, and the first star came out, and I followed at the back of the crowd because I could not make myself do more and could not make myself do less, and I have never in my life felt smaller than I felt on that road. And then there was a horse across the way. He'd come up so quiet nobody marked him till he was there. A big weathered dun, and on it a big weathered man, sitting so still he might have been part of the animal, right in the middle of the Tucson road where it narrowed between 2 arms of rock. So there was no going around him without leaving the trail, and no leaving the trail in the dark without breaking a horse's leg. He didn't have his gun in his hand. I want that understood. His rifle was in the scabbard and his pistol was on his hip, and his hands were folded on the saddle horn, easy as a man waiting on a stage. And that was somehow worse for the crowd than if he'd drawn, because a drawn gun you can rush, but a man that calm you have to wonder about. It was Elias Crane. Now I have to stop and tell you about Elias Crane, or you won't understand the rest, and you have to understand the rest. Crane ran cattle up in the high country north of the valley, a hard poor spread that a soft man couldn't have made pay, and a hard man barely could. He'd been in the country 20 years, and I doubt he'd spoken 200 words in town in all that time. He came in for supplies 4 times a year, paid in cash, said thank you and good day, and rode out, and that was the whole of Elias Crane as far as Sabino Wells was concerned. Folks called him standoffish. Folks called him cold. The younger men, who are always fools, called him worse than that when they were sure he was out of earshot, on account of he'd once thrown 2 of them out of my very livery by the collars for tormenting a broke-down horse, and done it without raising his voice or changing his face, which unnerves a certain kind of young man worse than a beating. But I knew a thing about Elias Crane that the town had mostly forgotten, because it happened before some of them were born, and because he never spoke of it, and neither did I, out of respect. 20 years back, when he first came into the country, he'd had a wife. Nobody in Sabino Wells hardly ever saw her. They kept so to themselves up on that mountain, but I saw her once or twice when he brought her down to my livery, a slight pretty woman named Mara who laughed easy and touched his arm when she talked to him, and you could see the whole of that hard man rearrange itself around her like she was the only warm thing in a cold world. And she died. She died up on that mountain in a hard winter, birthing their child, with no doctor in 40 miles and the passes shut with snow, and the child died with her, and Elias Crane rode down out of those hills in the spring a different man than the one who'd gone up, and he had lived alone ever since, 20 years, with his cattle and his dogs and his grief, and he had never once, that I know of, blamed a living soul for what the mountain and the winter took from him. He knew exactly whose fault a death like that is. It's nobody's. It's the country's and the cold's, and the plain hard fact that we are all of us mortal, and the frontier does not care. He had learned that the hardest way a man can learn it, and he had made his peace with the not blaming. And I believe that is the thing that put him across that road. Because here is what I think happened, though he never told me and I never asked. I think somewhere up on his mountain, word had reached Elias Crane that the town of Sabino Wells was fixing to run a woman off into the desert for the crime of failing to save a life that couldn't be saved. And I think that man, who had spent 20 years learning not to blame anybody for exactly such a loss, heard it and could not sit still. Because he knew. He knew in his bones what it was to have a woman die in your arms in the dark with the country against you. And he knew that if there had been a midwife in his cabin that winter, she might have been the only reason he had a wife or a child left at all. And he knew that the men marching that widow into the desert were pointing their grief at the one person who had actually tried to help. He knew it the way you know a thing that happened to your own body. And he came down off his mountain, 40 miles in a day, to stand across a road. Vernon Slade found his voice first, the way that kind always does. He called out, "This is town business, Crane. Ride on." And Elias Crane looked down that crowd slow from one end to the other, taking in every lantern-lit face, and when he'd looked at all of them he said one word. He said, "Enough." That was all. Enough. Not a speech, not a threat, not a Bible verse. One word in a voice that had rust on it from not being used, a voice like a barn door that hasn't swung in a season, and it landed in that crowd heavier than a shot. Because there is a thing that happens when one man who is not afraid stands in front of 40 men who are half ashamed. The 40 men have been holding each other up. Every one of them has been leaning on the courage of the man beside him, and none of them alone would have done this thing. And they all know it, and they all know the others know it, and it only takes one still man standing crosswise to that shared cowardice to make the whole thing feel, all at once, like what it is. He didn't have to fight them. He just had to make them look at themselves in the light of one man who wasn't playing along, and a crowd cannot bear to be looked at that way. It's the thing they went into the crowd to escape. Royce Dunmore pushed to the front, and his face was awful, gray and wet and twisted, and he said, "That woman killed my wife." And Elias Crane looked at him a long moment, and there was something in his face then that I have never forgotten, because it wasn't anger. A man braced for anger doesn't know what to do with the thing he saw in Elias Crane's face, which was grief. One man's grief looking at another's, plain and terrible and equal across a lantern-lit road. And Crane said, "Quiet," so quiet the men in back had to strain for it. "No. The country killed your wife same as it kills all of ours. And you're so ashamed you didn't send for the doctor she asked you, for that you'd rather bury a lie than live with the truth. I know you, Dunmore. I know exactly what you are, because I spent a winter being it. Only I had the decency to hate myself for it instead of a woman who tried to save her." I have never heard a silence like the one that fell then. Royce Dunmore's mouth worked and no sound came out, and I watched the truth of it go across his face like a cloud shadow crosses a hill, and I believe that in that one moment, whatever came after, Royce Dunmore knew that everything Elias Crane had said was so. Crane turned the Dun sideways and made a place beside him on the road, and he looked at Junia, and he said, "Ma'am, you don't have to go anywhere with these men, and you don't have to go anywhere with me neither. But there's a horse here if you'd rather ride out of this on your own terms than be marched out on theirs. Your choice, nobody else's." And she looked at him, the first time those two ever really looked at each other, in a road in the dark, with a whole town's shame standing between them, and she made her choice. She walked, straight-backed, out of the middle of that crowd, and not a hand was lifted to stop her, and she came to his stirrup, and he reached down one big scarred hand and she took it, and he swung her up behind him easy as lifting a child. And then he did the thing that told me, more than anything else that night, what kind of man he was. He didn't gallop off, he walked that horse. He walked it right back through the middle of the crowd, slow, making every one of them step aside and make room, making every one of them stand there in his lantern light, and watch the woman they'd meant to murder by desert ride out safe and upright, so that not one of them could ever tell himself afterward that it had been a small thing, or a fast thing, or a thing he hadn't quite seen. He walked her through them at a funeral pace, and the only sound was the Dun's hooves in the dust, and I stood at the edge of it with my rasp still in my hand, and I wept. An old man, I'm not ashamed to say it now, though I was ashamed of near everything else about myself that night. That was the end of the first part of it. But it wasn't the end of anything, because a town doesn't forgive you for showing it its own face. If anything, it hates you worse for it. The desert was one danger. What came after was another. Elias Crane took Junia Ellard up to his spread in the high country that night, and I know the tongues of Sabino Wells did exactly what you'd expect a town's tongues to do about a widow living out at a bachelor's ranch, and I know Junia knew they'd do it, and I know Elias knew, and here is the measure of both of them. They did not care, and they did not make it into anything it wasn't. I know how it was up there because in the weeks after, I hauled supplies up to the Crane place more than once, partly because I was ashamed and wanted to be of some use, and partly, I'll own, because I was an old man who'd watched a wrong done and wanted to see it start to come right. So I saw it with my own eyes. He gave her the cabin. That's the first thing. He gave that woman his own cabin, the cabin he'd built with his own hands and shared one winter with Mara and slept in alone for 20 years, and he moved himself out to the bunkhouse with his one hired hand, an old Mexican vaquero named Tomás who'd been with him near the whole 20 years and who thought the sun rose and set on his patron. There was never one moment's impropriety in it, and anybody who says different is repeating a lie, and I'll say to their face what I've said here. She kept his house because she chose to and because idle hands would have driven her mad, and he worked his cattle, and they took their meals at the same table with old Tomás as chaperone and company, and slow, so slow you could hardly mark it day to day. Two people who had each buried the center of their own life began to thaw toward the fire of the others. It was not a sudden thing, and it was not a foolish thing. These were not young people struck stupid by each other's faces. These were two grown, grieved, weathered souls who had each thought the warm part of life was behind them for good, and who found, to their own great surprise, that it wasn't that the heart is a stubborn organ and will put out a green shoot in the driest ground if you give it the smallest reason. And the reason they gave each other, before ever there was a soft word between them, was respect. He respected her the way you respect a person who has stood straight in front of a mob. She respected him the way you respect a man who came 40 miles to stand crosswise to his own town for a stranger. Everything that came after grew up out of that ground, and ground like that grows strong things. I'll tell you the small moments, because the small moments are where the truth of a thing lives. There was the evening I came up with a load of winter flour, and found her out in his kitchen garden, which had gone to weeds and hardpan in 20 years of a bachelor's neglect, and she had it half turned over and coming back to life, greens and beans and squash, and Elias was standing at the fence with his hat in his hands watching her work like a man watching a sunrise he'd forgotten the sky could make. He didn't know I saw him. When she straightened and pushed her hair back with the back of her wrist and said something to him and laughed, I watched that whole hard man rearrange himself around the sound of it, the exact way I'd watched him do around Mara 20 years before, and I thought, well, there it is. It's happening whether either of them means it to or not. Grief thinks it's the last word, but it isn't. Life is the last word. Life is always the last word. There was the time one of his hands, he had two others besides Tamaz, come the fall gather, took a horn in the thigh working a wild steer, an ugly wound gone bad and hot by the time they got him to the cabin, and the nearest doctor 40 miles down a mountain, and Junia opened her bag and cleaned it and drew the poison and packed it with her herbs and sat up with that man 3 nights running, and he lived, and he walked. And to this day, if you go up to that country, there's a wrangler named Pete Sorrell with a scar on his thigh who will tell you the midwife of Sabino Wells is the reason he's got a leg. She saved a life that autumn plain as day in front of witnesses on a mountain, and word of it came down to town. And do you think it changed a single mind in Sabino Wells? It did not. That is the thing about a lie a town has agreed to believe. Truth alone won't shift it. The truth has to be shoved right down the town's own throat where it can't be spat out, and that reckoning was still coming, but it was coming. And there was the evening, Tamaz told me this one, years after, when he was an old man and I was older. The evening Elias Crane finally said the thing plainly. He'd been circling it for weeks the way a shy man does, all gruffness and long silences. And Junia, who I promise you saw straight through him from the first, had the patience to let him get there in his own time. Tamaz said Elias came in from the range one dusk and stood in the door of the cabin turning his hat in his hands, and he said, "Miss Junia, I've been thinking. The town's not going to take you back easy, and there's talk about you living here, and it isn't right you should wear that on my account." And she said, "Elias Crane, I don't wear anything on your account. I wear what I choose." And he said, and Tamaz swore this was the words, "Then I'd count it the honor of my life if you choose to wear my name." Not to stop the talk, not to give you a roof, you've earned 10 roofs, but because I have been 20 years alone up here, and I never once wanted it to end till the night I found you standing in a road. I'm a hard old man and a poor hand at saying things. But you've made this place warm again, and I'd like it to stay warm, and I'd like to stay in it with you if you'll have me. Your choice, same as it's always been. Your choice, same as it's always been. He said that to her at the beginning on the road, and he said it to her at the end in the doorway, because that was the bone-deep truth of the man. He would protect that woman with his life, but he would never, not for one instant, presume to own one breath of her. And she chose him. Of course she chose him. She said yes with tears standing in her eyes, tears she'd not shed for the mob or the desert or the whole town's cruelty. And Tamaz said the old vaquero had to leave the room, because a man that happy and that grieved at once oughtn't be watched. But I've gotten ahead of the reckoning, and the reckoning is the part you need most to hear, because without it this is just a story of two lonely people finding each other, and it was more than that. It was the town's own sin coming back around to be answered, and it came back around, the way it always does, through a door nobody expected. It came back around through a birth. That winter was a hard one, the hardest in years, and up on the North Range it was harder than anywhere. And it happened, by one of those turns that a man could call chance if he didn't know better, that the wife of Deke Sorrel was brought to her time in the deep of it, in the worst of the weather, in a homestead cabin a good ways up the same mountain trail that led to the Crane spread. Now Deke Sorrel, cousin to that wrangler Pete whose leg Junia saved, was one of the men who had marched Junia Ellard toward the desert that dusk. I saw him there, lantern in his hand and the crowdanimal in his eyes. And now his wife, Letty, a girl of 19 barely, was in a hard labor 2 days long with the child come wrong, and the pass down to Tucson, shut solid with snow, and no doctor within reach of any horse alive. And Letty Sorrel was dying, and everyone in that cabin knew it, and there was one person in 40 miles who could save her. I had this next part from 3 different people over the years, and they all told it the same, so I'll set it down as sure. Deke Sorrel got on his horse in a blizzard that no sane man rides out in, and he rode up the mountain to the Crane place, and he got down off that horse near frozen, and he stood in the snow outside the cabin where he had helped to hound the woman inside it, and he could not make himself knock. He stood there, they say, a long while with the truth of what he'd done freezing onto him along with the snow, because he needed her. His wife was dying and he needed the murderess the town had made her out to be, and the whole rotten lie of it was standing there in the cold with him, and he couldn't knock, because to knock was to confess. It was Junia who opened the door. She'd heard the horse. She stood in the doorway with the firelight behind her, and she looked at Deke Sorrel, who had marched her toward the desert to die, standing hat in hand and blue with cold and unable to speak. And she knew, a woman like that knows, exactly why a man rides up a mountain in a blizzard. And do you know what she did? She was already reaching for her bag. She didn't make him say it. She didn't make him beg or grovel or take back the word witch to her face, though God knows she was owed all of that and more. She saw a woman was dying and a baby with her, and every other thing in the world fell away from Junia Ellard the way it always did when there was a life to be saved, and she said, "How long has she been laboring, and is the child turned or crosswise?" Already pulling on her coat, already out the door. And Elias Crane, without one word passing between them, was already saddling the dun and his own good snow horse, because he knew his wife to be, and he knew there was no keeping her off that mountain and no reason to try, and the only thing to do was get her there alive. They rode down that mountain in a blizzard, the 3 of them in the dark on a trail you couldn't see, and any one of them could have died doing it, and they knew it, and they went. That is who those 2 people were. The town had tried to feed her to the desert, and when the desert came for one of the town's own, she rode straight into a killing storm to save the wife of a man who'd helped hound her, and she never once weighed whether he deserved it, because to Junia Ellard a dying woman did not have to deserve saving. She only had to be dying. That was enough. She was in that Sorrel cabin the better part of 2 days. I won't tell you the hard particulars of it, because they aren't mine to tell, and because Junia never told them to a soul, being a woman who understood that a birthing room is a kind of church, and what happens in it is sacred and private. I'll tell you only the shape of it. The child was wrong, the same way the Dunmore child had been wrong, only worse, and Letty Sorrel was near gone, and it wanted every particle of skill and nerve that woman possessed, and 2 days of it without sleep, and there was a night in the middle when even Junia thought she'd lose them both. But she didn't. She turned that child with her 2 hands in the dark, the way she'd learned to do in 100 rooms, gentle and sure, and she brought it into the world alive, a girl, squalling and furious and pink, and she brought Letty's sorrel back from the very edge of the far country and set her feet again on this side of it. And when the fever came after she broke it with her herbs, sitting up a third night, and on the fourth morning the storm blew out and the sun came up clean and cold over a mountain white as a wedding. And Letty's sorrel was sitting up in her bed, nursing her daughter. And Deke's sorrel came out of that cabin into the snow and got down on his knees in it, to Junia, in front of Elias Crane and old Tomaz and his own 2 ranch hands. That hard, proud frontiersman who'd carried a lantern in the mob got down on his knees in the snow and could not speak for weeping. And Junia, this is the thing about her, this is the whole of her. Junia took him by the arm and lifted him up out of the snow and told him to get up, that a man had no business on his knees to anybody, and that his wife wanted him and his daughter needed a name, and that all the rest could be settled by the fire where it was warm. She didn't want his groveling. She never had. She only ever wanted to be let to do the good she was made to do. Now here is where the town's reckoning came, and it came because Deke Sorrel, whatever else he'd been, was not a coward once his eyes were open, and once his eyes were open there was no shutting them. When the passes cleared enough to travel, Deke Sorrel came down off that mountain, and he rode into Sabino Wells with his wife alive and his daughter in her arms, and he did not do it quiet. He stood up in the middle of the street, in front of my livery, in front of the Slade Mercantile, in front of everybody, and he told the whole town at the top of his lungs what had happened. He told them a dying woman had been saved by the very hands they'd called cursed. He told them how he'd been unable even to knock, so black was the thing he'd done, and how she'd reach for her bag before he could speak a word. He told them Elias Crane had ridden a blizzard to bring her to save the wife of a man who'd helped drive her toward the desert. And then he did the thing that broke it open. He turned on Vernon Slade, who was standing in his own doorway gone the color of ash, and he said, "You made me part of a murder, Slade. You near made me help kill the only soul in this county who could have saved my Letty. If I'd had my way that dusk, my wife and my baby would both be in the ground right now, and you'd have called it justice. So don't you ever again tell me what's righteous. You don't know the word." And it went through that town like a breakup goes through a frozen river. Once the first crack runs, the whole ice goes at once. Because the truth was that half the people in Sabino Wells had never been easy about that dusk, had gone along out of fear or spite or the sheer animal pull of the crowd, and had lain awake since with the sick knowledge of what they'd nearly done. Deke Sorrel's shout gave them leave to feel it out loud. And once one man could say it, they all could, and there came out then, all at once, the thing that had been true the whole time and that everyone had helped to bury, that Junia Ellard had begged Royce Dunmore to send for a doctor, and he hadn't, and that the death of Cass Dunmore lay at no door but his own. It was Royce Dunmore himself who set the last stone of it. I'll give him that at the very end. He came to me, the liveryman of all people, I suppose because I'd been on that road and hadn't been part of the mob, and he asked me to drive him up the mountain to the Crane place, because he could not, he said, ask that woman to come down to him. He had no right to ask her anything. He'd go to her. And I drove him up, a broken gray man in the back of my wagon, and I stood at the fence with old Tomaz while Royce Dunmore stood in Elias Crane's kitchen garden, the garden Junia had brought back from Hardpan, and said to her the thing he'd have given his whole fortune not to have to say, which was that he knew now it had been his doing and not hers, that his stubbornness and his pride had killed his Cass, that he had blamed her to keep from blaming himself, and that there was no forgiveness he had any right to ask for, and he wasn't there to ask it. He was only there, he said, so that she would know that he knew, so that she wouldn't have to go the rest of her life as the only person on earth who knew the truth of that night. He owed her that much. He'd have his boy raised to know her name and what she'd truly done, and he'd say it in front of the whole town, and he had. And Junia Ellard, who had every right in this world to turn her back on that man, looked at him a long moment, and then she said the thing that I have tried and failed for 40 years to be big enough to have said myself. She said, "Mr. Dunmore, I have hated you. I won't lie about it, for it would dishonor the truth I nearly died defending. But I have buried a husband, and I have learned that grief will make a devil of the best of us if we let it, and I have watched a man come down off this mountain. And here she looked at Elias, who lost more than you ever did and never once made another soul carry it. So I'll tell you what he taught me without ever meaning to. Nobody killed your wife. The country did. It's the hardest thing there is to believe, and it's the only thing that will ever let you sleep. Go home to your son, raise him gentle, and when he's old enough, tell him his mother was loved and tell him the truth of how she died, and let that be the whole of it. I don't forgive you because it isn't mine to forgive, it's Cass's, and she's past our reach. But I'm done hating you. I've got a garden to tend. And she turned back to her beans. And Royce Dunmore stood there a moment with the whole weight of 20 men lifted off him, and then he took off his hat to her, that rich proud man to a widow in a kitchen garden, and he got back in my wagon and I drove him down the mountain, and he never was quite the same man after, which is to say he was a better one. They were married in the spring, Elias Crane and Junia Ellard, up on the mountain, with the passes open, and the wildflowers out, and old Tamaz standing up for the groom and Letty Sorrel standing up for the bride. Letty carrying that baby girl she'd named Junia, of course. What else would she have named her? Half of Sabino Wells rode up for it in the end, hats in hand, humbled, and Junia let them come, because she was not a woman to nurse a grudge past its use, and because a wedding is a thing a whole community ought to share whether it deserves to or not. But she never moved back down to that town. She kept her home on the mountain with her hard, tender husband to the end of her days, and she went on being the midwife of that whole high country for 30 more years, and there is not a family up there that doesn't owe her a life or two. And when she died, an old, old woman in the same cabin with Elias, who outlived her by only a season, being unable, I think, to abide the cold once she was gone from it, holding her hand. There were near 200 people at the burying, and every last one of them knew exactly what she was, not what a town had once tried to say she was, what she was. I'll tell you the last thing, and then I'm done, because it's the thing I go back to when the nights are long and I'm ashamed of my own small heart. That first night out on the Tucson road, when Elias Crane walked her back through the middle of that crowd at a funeral pace, as they came clear of the last lantern and the town fell away behind them into the dark, I was standing near enough to see it, and I saw Junia Ellard's hand, where it rested on that hard man's shoulder to steady herself. She hadn't wept all through it, not once. But I saw her hand in the last of the light, and it was trembling, the only part of her that let go, the one true tremor she'd kept back from the whole cruel town, and she let it out only there, only to him, only where nobody was meant to see. And I saw Elias Crane reach up, without turning his head, without a word, and lay his own big scarred hand over hers on his shoulder, just for a moment, just till it stilled. And then they rode on up into the dark toward the mountain, and the desert they'd meant to feed her to fell away on either side like a thing that had lost, and the first hard stars came out over the whole cruel and beautiful country, and I stood in the road an old fool with a rasp in my hand, and understood that I had just watched the beginning of the best thing that would ever happen to either of those two grieved and stubborn people, and that all it had cost was one man, at the right moment, willing to put himself across a road and say the one word that a crowd cannot bear to hear. Enough. I've thought about that word every day of my life since. It's the shortest sermon I ever heard preached, and the truest, and it was preached from the back of a dun horse by a man who spoke maybe 200 words to that town in 20 years and never needed the 201st. When the whole world's boots are marching in one wrong direction at dusk, it takes just the one still man to turn his horse crosswise and say it, and mean it, and not move. I wasn't that man, God knows I wasn't, but I saw him, and now you have too. And maybe that's why an old liveryman tells it, all these years on, to anybody who will sit still long enough to listen, so that the next time the boots come down the road at dusk, there'll be one more soul in the crowd who knows what a single crosswise horse can do, and who'll ride out to be it. It only ever takes the one.